Sometime between 1800 and 1853, a girl no older than 19 took her final breath in the liberty of the Clink, that narrow strip of Southwark where the Bishop of Winchester's laws had governed for 7 centuries. She stood just 4 feet 7 inches tall. She weighed perhaps 6 stone. Etched into her skull were the unmistakable lesions of advanced syphilis, a disease she had almost certainly contracted as a child. No one recorded her name. No one noted the date. No one marked her grave with so much as a wooden cross. She was lowered into a pit already thick with coffins, stacked 9 deep in places, the cheapest dockyard timber available, their sides nearly touching. The earth closed over her, and for 140 years she remained there in the dark, beneath the factories and warehouses that rose and fell above her bones. Then, in February 1993, a team of 5 archaeologists began digging into the ground at Red Cross Way, racing against a 6-week deadline to clear space for an electricity substation. They had been told the site was a former burial ground. They had not been told what they would find. Skeleton CW1211 emerged from the London clay with her skull intact, her small frame curled in the position she had been placed more than a century before. The archaeologists photographed her, catalogued her, analysed the telltale pitting on her bones. They determined her age, her height, the progression of the illness that had ravaged her since childhood. And then they gave her a name that would outlast the anonymity she had been consigned to. Crossbones Girl. She was not alone. Beneath that small rectangle of Southwark earth, an estimated 15,000 others lay buried, the forgotten and the forsaken of a city that had used them, profited from them, and then denied them even the dignity of consecrated ground. Their story had been silenced for centuries. But silence, as the people of Southwark would learn, is not the same as forgetting. To understand how 15,000 souls came to rest beneath an unmarked patch of land, one must first understand the peculiar geography of medieval London and the loophole in its morality. The City of London, that square mile north of the Thames, operated under strict civic law. Certain trades were forbidden within its walls. Certain pleasures were outlawed. But Southwark, on the river's southern bank, lay outside the city's jurisdiction. It was a liberty, a district where different rules applied, and for the 70 acres known as the Liberty of the Clink, the rules were written by the Bishop of Winchester. His palace stood on the riverbank, its great rose window gazing out over the water. And stretching along the streets behind it were the establishments that paid him rent. The stews of Bankside, the licensed houses where women known as Winchester Geese worked under regulations set down by the church itself. The arrangement was extraordinary. As many as 18 establishments operated at the trade's peak, each marked with painted signs facing the Thames: the Boar's Head, the Cardinal's Hat, the Castle, the Bell. The bishop's ordinances governed their operations with meticulous detail. No woman could be held against her will, on penalty of 100 shillings. No debts exceeding 6 shillings and 8 pence could be extended to prevent bondage through obligation. Constables were required to conduct regular inspections, searching for women kept by force. The church had, in effect, created one of Europe's first regulated districts for the trade. The women were licensed, taxed, and supervised. The bishop collected his rents. The crown looked the other way. But there was a cost to this arrangement, and the women paid it in full. The same church that licensed their labour declared it a mortal transgression. The same bishops who profited from their rent denied them the rights of Christian burial. The chronicler John Stow recorded this in 1598, drawing on the testimony of ancient men of good credit. He wrote that these single women were forbidden the rights of the church so long as they continued that sinful life, and that they were excluded from Christian burial if they were not reconciled before their end. Only those who left the profession and received absolution could be laid to rest in consecrated ground. The rest were consigned to an unconsecrated plot far from the parish church. Stowe called it the single woman's churchyard. It was a theological trap of breathtaking cruelty. The church created the conditions for their work, extracted wealth from their labour, and then condemned them for the very existence it had sanctioned. In life, they were useful. In passing, they became outcasts. Henry VIII closed the stews permanently in 1546, but the burial ground endured. By 1769, it had become a pauper's cemetery for St Saviour's Parish, receiving the destitute, the unknown, and the unclaimed bodies fished from the Thames. The coffins accumulated. The graves multiplied. A parish letter from 1832 reported that the ground was so very full of coffins that burial was possible only within 2 feet of the surface, and the effluvium was so very offensive that the consequences might prove injurious to the surrounding neighbourhood. In 1853, authorities declared the site completely overcharged with the departed, and that further interments were inconsistent with public health and public decency. The gates were locked. The ground was abandoned. And for the next century and a half, 15,000 souls lay beneath the feet of Londoners who had no idea they were walking on graves. The rediscovery began, as so many stories do, with construction. In 1989, London Regional Transport purchased the Red Cross Way site for the Jubilee Line extension. The preliminary archaeological survey in 1990 confirmed what historical records had suggested. Human remains lay beneath the industrial debris. Between 1991 and 1998, the Museum of London Archaeology Service excavated an area roughly the size of 2.5 tennis courts, racing against development deadlines, working in conditions they would later describe as severely time-pressured. They recovered 148 skeletons, based on the extraordinary density of burials, packed so tightly that coffin sides nearly touched. They calculated that this sample represented less than 1% of the total interments. The extrapolation was staggering, as many as 15,000 individuals buried in layers of forgotten humanity. 70% of the excavated remains were children under 18. 50 were infants who died at birth or shortly after. The bones showed evidence of lives lived in deprivation, rickets from vitamin D deficiency, scurvy from insufficient nutrition, and periostitis from chronic infection. Among adults, 69% were female. Many bore the skeletal signatures of repetitive physical labour and untreated illness. These were London's invisible poor, and they were about to find their voice. On November 23, 1996, a playwright and poet named John Constable experienced what he would later describe as a visitation. Walking near the site, he felt compelled to write, and the words that emerged would become the Southwark Mysteries, a cycle of poems and plays channeling the voice of a figure he called the Goose, a spirit speaking for all the Winchester Geese, and Outcast departed who had been silenced by history. Constable proposed something both radical and simple. Remember them, not with apology, not with academic study alone, but with ritual, with presence, with the simple act of returning to their graves and speaking their names into the darkness. The campaign that followed would last 23 years. Constable and his partner, Katie Nichols, founded the Friends of Crossbones, an informal network of activists, artists, and ordinary Londoners who refused to let the burial ground vanish beneath another office block. In 1998, they held the first Halloween of Crossbones, tying ribbons to the iron gates on Red Cross Way, transforming a barrier into a shrine. In 1999, a planning application for 3 4-story buildings was refused. The Southwark Mysteries premiered at Shakespeare's Globe and Southwark Cathedral in April 2000, performed by over 100 volunteers across both venues, the voices of the forgotten finally echoing in spaces of power. But the land remained in limbo. Transport for London owned it. Development pressure continued. a car park application in 2008 was rejected. A guerrilla gardener named Andy Hume, working as an on-site security guard, began transforming the rubble-strewn lot into something unexpected. A garden decorated with oyster shells, a quiet memorial amid the chaos of urban renewal. On June 23, 2004, the Friends held their first monthly vigil at the gates. They have not missed a month since. The ritual is simple. At 7 in the evening on the 23rd of each month, people gather at the iron gates festooned with ribbons, feathers, photographs, and handwritten messages. Poems are read. Candles are lit. The names of the outcast departed are spoken aloud, their existence acknowledged by living voices in a city that once preferred to forget them. By December 2024, the 247th consecutive vigil had been held. 247 months of standing witness. 20 years of refusing to let silence win. The campaign achieved what had seemed impossible. In 2006, Southwark Council installed a commemorative plaque, the first official acknowledgement of the site's significance. In 2008, the council approved £100,000 for a memorial garden. In 2013, London Underground issued a licence to Constable for gardening and maintenance. In 2014, Transport for London granted a temporary lease to the Bankside Open Spaces Trust to create a proper garden of remembrance. And then, on July 22, 2015, something happened that had never occurred in the burial ground's entire history. The Dean of Southwark Cathedral crossed the street from his church and conducted the first act of regret, remembrance, and restoration. For the first time, the Anglican Church formally blessed the ground where the Winchester Geese and the Outcast poor had been denied Christian burial for centuries. The Dean said that we cannot undo the sins of yesterday, but we can do right today. It was not absolution. It was not erasure. It was acknowledgement, belated by 400 years, that an institution had profited from people it had condemned, and that some debts can only be paid in the currency of memory. John Constable held his final vigil on November 23, 2019, completing what he called a 23-year magical work. He had begun at 54, he ended at 67. The campaign he started continues without him. Between 2019 and 2021, the Bankside Open Spaces Trust secured a 30-year lease from Transport for London, guaranteeing the garden's survival through 2050. The site that developers once valued at £30 million is now protected public space, a patch of wildflowers and dry stone walls and memorial shrines in one of London's most rapidly transforming neighbourhoods. The gates remain the most striking feature. Visitors still tie ribbons to the iron bars, still leave feathers and photographs and handwritten prayers. The shrine has become something the campaigners never fully planned, a living memorial, constantly changing, constantly renewed by the hands of strangers who feel compelled to acknowledge the forgotten. Beneath the garden, thousands of remains lie undisturbed. Only the footprint of the electricity substation was excavated. The rest of the 15,000 are still there, in the darkness, their coffins rotted away, their bones mingled with the London clay. Every visitor to the Garden of Remembrance walks above the departed without necessarily realizing it. In 2022, archaeologists working on the adjacent plot made an unrelated discovery that reminded London of its deeper past. The most intact Roman mausoleum ever found in Britain, complete with extraordinarily preserved mosaics buried beneath the very ground the Bishop of Winchester had once governed. The liberty of the Clink, it turned out, had been a place of the departed for nearly 2,000 years. Southwark has always been where London buried what it preferred not to see. The moral complexity of the Crossbones story resists easy resolution. The church's 2015 blessing was powerful precisely because it came so late. An institution that had created the conditions for suffering, that had extracted wealth from women it simultaneously condemned, took 4 centuries to offer even a word of regret. Some wounds do not heal, they are simply acknowledged. And yet, what the campaigners achieved matters. 15,000 people who were meant to be forgotten have been remembered. A girl who stood 4 feet 7 inches tall, whose skull bore the marks of a disease she contracted as a child, has a name now, even if it is only Crossbones Girl. Her facial reconstruction, created by Professor Caroline Wilkinson using 3D laser scanning, gives us a face to look upon, a person to recognize, a reminder that the departed were not abstractions, but individuals, each with their own brief passage through the world. Today, the Garden of Remembrance opens to visitors on Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and the first Saturday of each month, from 12 to 2 in the afternoon, tended by volunteers who ask nothing in return except that people remember. The ribbons on the gates multiply. The vigils continue. The departed remain. What does it mean to rescue the forgotten from oblivion? Perhaps only this: that the measure of a city is not the monuments it builds to the powerful, but the care it takes with those who had no power at all. The Winchester Geese were licensed by bishops and condemned by the same breath. The paupers of St. Saviour's were buried in ground so crowded that coffins sat inches below the surface. The children, so many children, were laid to rest before they had the chance to become anything at all. They asked for nothing. They expected nothing. And for a century and a half, they received exactly what they expected. But someone chose to remember. Someone tied a ribbon to an iron gate. Someone spoke a name into the London night. And beneath the streets of Southwark, 15,000 outcasts are no longer alone.